thrilled to have you. Welcome to the Bonding Hour with Dr. Justin Mogilski, who teaches at a university that I always mispronounce. What is it, Justin?
So it's the University of South Carolina. That's straightforward. But then it's Salkehatchie. Salkehatchie. It's
Salkehatchie.
Yes, one of their Palmetto College campuses.
Interesting.
Yep. Yeah. So the University of South Carolina really, they have their main campus in Columbia, and then there are many different campuses serving largely rural communities, and I'm in one of those. So from a fairly rural place right now, though I recently moved and bought a house and moved to a new place, which is why my background is all blurred, because it's a little bit chaotic at the moment.
Well, congratulations on the new house. That's exciting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congrats.
It's fun. It's tiring, but it's fun.
Yep. So as an academic, Dr. Mogilski, you clearly have a PhD. What did you study? What's your academic background?
So my background is, I'll actually go through all the degrees. So I got my undergraduate at Albright College. And how I kind of got into the field that I'm currently in is that I started working with someone named Dr. Susan Hughes, she is an evolutionary psychologist. That is the track that I ended up taking. I ended up doing some undergraduate research with her. I took her senior seminar, I think in sophomore year. So I was just really into the topic. I went into it. I was a TA for her research and statistics class, and went through that. Then I ended up going to my master's degree at Bucknell University, which is middle of Pennsylvania, working with someone named T. Joel Wade. And then I went for my PhD to Oakland University, which is Michigan, where I worked with people like doctors Todd Shackelford, Lisa Welling, Virgil Ziegler-Hill, Jennifer Vonk. It's kind of a hive mind of evolutionary-based researchers doing research from the perspective of comparative psychology across animals, personality and social psychology, looking at romantic relationships and of course the dynamic of romantic relationships. And so I was kind of forged in that environment. So originally my background, I was trained in evolutionary psychology. That's what I got my PhD in. And since then I feel that I've branched out a little bit, though that is the perspective that I primarily adopt when asking questions and forming hypotheses and collecting data and testing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I try to bring into my study of multi-partner relationships. Yep.
And what's the difference between evolutionary psychology and other you listed so many different kinds of psychology. Like what's the kind of general underlying themes of evolutionary psychology?
So depending on who you ask, there are some who would say that there is no psychology that is not evolutionary in some way, because the logic is that our brains are part of our bodies, and as much as our bodies have been shaped by the processes of evolution, natural selection, and all other selective processes, there's really nothing that we can say about the human brain, how we behave, the way that we think, without thinking about how has the way that our brain works, the way that our brain processes information, how has that been shaped by the recurrent challenges that humans have faced over their evolutionary history. So that's the idea. That the core premise is our brains are not just blank slates that we're born and you go into the world and then everything gets imprinted on it. We come to some degree prepared into the world with a brain that has been shaped by these challenges. And so there are kind of these stereotyped responses and ways of processing information that have been designed by evolution, natural selection, et cetera. So that's the overview. That's what I think sets it apart from everything else, is that it really incorporates that level of explanation from evolutionary biology, the biological sciences. And I think that's what attracted me to it originally, is the mind and the way that we think and the way that we reason, I think makes a lot more sense when you consider the biological processes that contribute to the way that we think, the patterns of thought that we have, and how we make decisions. So I think that's the best answer I can give.
So are you saying that some things about our personality or our interactions, things like that, some of they're kind of genetically hardwired or like written into our brain tissue?
So I don't like the term hardwired because it presumes that you're born, you have these tendencies, and they cannot change, right? The reality is, so I think a better way of thinking of it is that we come into the world prepared for our nervous systems to pick up certain connections and not others. So that's how the nervous system works in general, is through experience, certain connections become stronger. You have more stereotyped responses based on those experiences. And so, for example, if you are very young and one of the most well replicated findings is that humans have, and other species as well, very quickly pick up fears of things that we typically would have encountered and should have been fearful of throughout most of human history. So, for example, learning to be afraid of spiders, learning to be afraid of snakes is much easier than learning to be afraid of a flower. Spiders and snakes were much more of a recurrent threat, and so we come prepared to learn those things. That, I think, is the better way to think of it as, is what is hardwired is this tendency to pick up certain patterns, pick up on certain patterns and learn certain things. But of course, we absolutely have that potential to change how we respond and the way that we think and the way that we behave. Yeah. So hardwired is a term I get away from, but yes.
I absolutely hear that kind of unchanging, like set and in stone and never able, no plasticity available.
And especially humans, I mean, people, we rely so much on culture and group building and communication. There's so much of that goes into who we are, how that shapes our personality, and of course we change across the lifespan. So I think there's a lot of plasticity in there. Absolutely.
So it almost sounds like we're kind of predisposed towards fear of snakes, but if we never encounter a snake, we may never have snaky thoughts.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So yes, though some would argue that even things that look like snakes or resemble spiders or resemble snakes, it's going to trigger some of that kind of latent psychology there. And so even if you don't personally have an experience with something, you might still say, look, I think another one of the I don't know if you've ever heard of trypophobia. I think that's how it's said. I have a colleague who looks at that, where it's that pattern where, if you have a bunch of circles, very perfect circles, kind of aligned in like a hexagon, it looks like a beehive. I wish I brought like a photo or something, but if you look at it, it gives you that kind of uncomfortable feeling. Now, you may have never encountered a beehive before, you may have never actually been stung or anything, but there's something about that shape that might make you uncomfortable. And that is, again, something that humans have run into again and again throughout our history. And so it's even if you haven't had the experience, you might be sensitized to it, to some of those cues. Yeah. Yep.
So are we perhaps predisposed to be especially maybe afraid of the dark because we can't see what's in it and it could eat us?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and humans are not, we rely on vision for so much, right? Compared to other animals who might use olfactory or smell cues, sound. I think we are very visual creatures. And so, yes, when light is not on our side, then sure, be careful, be cautious, be afraid of things that could bump in the night, so to speak. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, let me just say before we transition to your research, just for you listeners out there to know, I am part of Dr. Mogilski's team, actually. I helped much more so at the beginning where they were shaping questions and thinking about things. Now that they're in data analysis, with quantitative data, I'm pretty much useless. So now I'm just there on the sidelines going, go you all, yay, these findings. So while I'm on the team, I'm not active right now. So tell me a little bit about—
You still inspire though, you still inspire. See, that's the thing about data analysis, is that a lot of it is, okay, we have what we predict, but then we have to interpret it. And that's where, experience with anything helps. So yeah.
But if that interpretation involves numbers.
Right. Sure. Okay. Yeah.
I'm at a loss.
I won't give you the equations. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. But yes, if you want to know meanings or interpretations or potential considerations, I'm all over that. Absolutely. So could you tell us a little bit? I'm kind of hinting at this team of yours that I'm on. Could you tell us about that team? What are we all studying together and how did we get here?
Yeah, so it's the multi-partner maintenance, the multi-partner maintenance strategies project. Sorry, the multi-partner relationship maintenance project. We've gone through several iterations and we finally settled on that. But
I thought there was an R in there.
Yeah, there is an R in there. Here's the thing: we use like the same acronym for the measure and for the project, so I get those confused sometimes. But what we're doing, so it's an international project. It was actually grant funded. So my university, I applied for what's called an Aspire 1 Innovation Grant. It's about $15,000. I ended up getting it, and what the grant was written for is we wanted to identify, if people are practicing things, consensual non-monogamy, things like polyamory, swinging, open relationships, the current what's currently understood is that people are doing this. They're doing it successfully. They're creating these satisfying outcomes, both for themselves, for their partners, romantically, and of course, through your work as well, Eli, in families and for children. And so we know that this is happening, but it's still not quite clear what strategies people are using to manage the problems that can arise in a non-monogamous situation. What we know from just decades of research, and of course, a lot of the research has largely been monocentric, but what we know is that non-monogamy is and can be complicated. I think that there are things that can go wrong in a non-monogamous relationship that you might not typically encounter in a monogamous relationship. And so, how do you manage the spread of, just to pull out some random things, rivalry between partners for another's affection? How do you manage STI transmission? How do you manage jealousy and some of the negative feelings and the anxiety and the mental health concerns that can come from having more than one partner? And so we wanted to identify and quantify what those strategies are, and ultimately create a measure that people could complete that we could then use to see, how often do you engage in each of these distinct strategies for managing non-monogamy. So what we did was I assembled this team after it got the grant funding. We all got together. We met over Zoom several times, and we started hashing out, what would this measure look like? What do we think are the best and worst strategies for managing something like polyamory or swinging? And from there, we started to collect data from the community. We sent out what's called an ACT nomination survey, where we simply ask people, okay, write down, what do you think are the best practices? What do you think are the worst practices? And we solicited that from the community. We then took those responses, we combined it with what we thought some of these strategies would be, and we created this measure, the multi-partner relationship maintenance scale, which quantifies, so when I say quantify, it measures a person's tendency to engage in certain behaviors within a non-monogamous relationship. And we identified 10 different strategies. We took that measure, we're pairing it with several other established measures and administering it in a series of surveys. And from doing that, what we can then do is start to validate that scale. Say, is this scale actually measuring what we think it's measuring? And then what does it predict about people's relationship satisfaction or the kinds of conflicts that they get into in their relationship? And are they actually managing these conflicts that might arise, or their personal health and well-being? So that's the idea, is we're trying to measure these strategies and then see whether this scale that we've created is predicting people's relationship outcomes. And we think that that's going to fill in a very important gap in the literature. That is, people are saying they're making these relationships work and they're successful, and we have evidence of that. We just don't quite have a standard set of strategies by which people do that. And so I hope this will provide that standardization, I think. So that's our goal. Yep.
And how are the findings going so far? I know you've been getting waves and waves of data.
So we have, so there are 3 surveys in total. We have finished data collection for survey 1 in the US. We have enough there. We're still collecting them here and there. We have a pretty good European sample size, but we're still looking for places in especially the Middle East, parts of Africa, Pacific Asia, South America. So we have we had the first survey kind of done. We've done the analyses that we want to do. We've tested whether this measure is assessing what we think it's assessing, and so far we have support for it. So we, not to get too bogged down with the stats, but we performed something called a factor analysis, an exploratory factor analysis, and then what's called a confirmatory factor analysis. The exploratory tells us, okay, if we predicted, and what we originally predicted is that we have these 10 strategies that people in CNM relationships are engaging in to manage their relationships. Oops, sorry, that's my dog. I hope that's not too loud. I lost my train of thought. If we have these 10 strategies, we perform this factor analysis. The factor analysis then tells us, are we actually observing these 10 strategies that we thought were there? And for the most part, supporting that, we actually ended up finding about 8 strategies from one set of factor analyses, and then in the follow-up, we were able to identify 9. So we have evidence to support that what these strategies that we think we're measuring, we seem to actually be measuring. And then we're looking at how people's scores on this measure then predict relationship satisfaction, and we're finding that. So we measured just overall relationship quality, just a global assessment of how satisfied are you in your relationship, but also how invested people are in their partners, how interdependent they are. That is, do you depend on one another for managing life and all the things that come with kind of, working with a romantic partner to set goals and meet them, and also sexual satisfaction. And we're finding that although the patterns are a little complex, where some strategies are better at predicting overall satisfaction versus others are good at predicting sexual satisfaction, but overall we're finding support for those associations. So these strategies are associated with relationship quality outcomes. And the other thing that we did was we recorded people's experiences with CNM. So not only whether they're currently in a CNM relationship, either poly, swinging, open, but also how often have you practiced this throughout your life? And we're finding that the more that people are experienced with CNM, the more likely they are to engage in these behaviors that we've identified. So these do seem to be the things that people in CNM relationships are doing. And in fact, people who had more experience with monogamy actually were less likely to do some of the things that we identified. So I'm very excited about the findings. We're writing everything up now. I'm hoping to get a full manuscript done before June. My final report for my grant is due on May 31st. So that's my nice little artificial deadline I'm setting for myself. So hopefully we'll have something soon.
Fantastic. Could you give us some examples of what these 10 strategies are that you're talking about?
So some of I'll tell you the strongest ones. So we've identified, we have evidence for 9. We originally identified 10, but we have evidence for 9. And I think some of the most interesting ones are things like what we labeled as attraction disclosure. So that is, do you disclose to your partner, or well, in this case, to your partner, but I imagine this generalizes, and I haven't tested that yet, but do you disclose to your partner who you're attracted to? So if there is someone out there who you interact with, maybe it's, a friend, a coworker, just someone that you interact with on a day-to-day basis or every so often, do you reveal to your partner that you are attracted to this person? I think that the tendency for a lot of people is, if you find someone attractive, just kind of keep that hush hush, keep that from your partner. Don't talk, don't open up a can of worms, right? But I think what we're finding is that people who score higher on that measure of attraction disclosure, who are more likely to disclose their attractions to other people, to their partner, they are experiencing better relationship satisfaction, almost across the board, for both for investment, sexual satisfaction, and overall relationship satisfaction. So something about telling your partner about your attractions, I think, is one of those things that people stay away from. But if you do it, it actually seems to help. And this is something that I've actually adopted in my own relationship. Is I've started to disclose my attractions to my wife, and she does the same for me, and we both feel more comfortable. And I think one of the things we have to test this. I don't have evidence to absolutely confirm this, but I think what's happening is, when your partner suspects that you find someone else attractive and you don't tell them that, you don't confirm that or not, that's something that lingers with you, right? That's something where you sit there and you go, are you attracted to this person? Is there something there? And so you build up all these different scenarios in your mind of, well, geez, what's going to happen? Are they flirting? Are they spending time? Are they going to, the term I like to use is mate poaching. Are they going to poach my mate away? Are they going to steal my partner from me? And so just disclosing that gets it all out in the open. And you say, well, yeah, I'm human. I have attractions to people. I find certain people attractive and I find them attractive. And you can then talk about whether it's something to worry about or whether there are boundaries that need to be put up because that attraction exists. So I think getting that out into the open allows partners to talk about and negotiate, okay, where can this go? Where can this not go? What's threatening to me? What's okay, et cetera. So that is the strongest factor, the one that was associated with with the most number of relationship quality outcomes. So I think there's going to be a lot there to that one. But I'd be happy to go over others as well.
Well, that is fascinating, because in so many monogamous relationships, the rules are you're not allowed to be attracted to other people. And if you are, you certainly can't talk about it. I mean, that's ridiculous. The concern, I think, is that it would spur insecurity and jealousy. But what I'm hearing is that insecurity and jealousy happens anyway.
Right.
And by talking about it, you're kind of diffusing it.
Right.
Oh, yes. That's golden.
Yeah, I think that's what's happening. I mean, that I think is the worst part is building those, is running those simulations in your mind, right? Is you suspect your partner's doing something. Well, what if it were the norm that you could communicate about that you could be honest about that, and instead of it being this big thing where, oh my God, I can't believe you're attracted to them, you just, okay, most people are going to be attracted to someone else within their lifetime. We are hot-blooded creatures. We will have those experiences. And so to accept that and then work with it, I think is a far better way to handle those problems than to hide it.
Well, and we have so much longer lifespans now than when we came up with the idea of monogamy. It's easy to be monogamous when you're dead by 30. Sure, it's after that it gets harder.
I'd say even up till 30, it's probably hard.
Absolutely. Definitely. But if well, we don't have to deal with each other for that much longer, one of us is going to die, it's less likely to get divorced.
Yeah. No, it's so that's the big one. So if you kind of, just to give a sampler of the other ones in case there's any that we want to focus on or maybe talk about more. The other factors were, so this one's probably a no-brainer, jealousy regulation. So whether you actually are able to sit down and communicate with your partner about the jealousy that you experience. So it's not just how much jealousy you experience or whether it's that, fiery kind of anxious feeling inside of you. It's do you actually communicate that to your partner, and do you feel comfortable communicating that to your partner? Because I think some people would be willing to communicate it, but they know that there might be costs to it, right? If you say to your partner, hey, I'm feeling jealous, you're setting yourself up for a conversation. You might even have an argument. Things might get heated. And so I think that's a difficult amount of work to do, is to communicate about jealousy. But people who do it, they again, this is another one of those factors that was associated with higher relationship quality. Jealousy regulation. There's also child care willingness. So that is, are you willing to help care for children? And we did distinguish, so we have the data, I haven't looked at it yet. We can distinguish those who are biologically related to children that perhaps they have with another person versus those who are not biologically related. And what we know is that, I mean, childcare issues, I think especially keeping fathers around, right, to help care for children, particularly if those children are not genetically related to the father, I think can be difficult. That can be an issue that pops up for a lot of people. So I think measuring what this factor measures is how willing would you be to help care for a child of someone else potentially in a kind of multi-partner situation. Yeah. Things like compersion. So that is the feelings of joy, pleasure from your partner interacting with someone in a romantic or an intimate way. What we called shared extra pair sexuality. So extra pair meaning outside of your immediate pair bond with another person. So if you are having sex with or engaging in any kind of sexuality with someone outside of the relationship, is your partner involved or are they not? And this is one of those measures that I think there's no clear answer about what's the best practice. I'll say that people who are more likely to engage in sexual behavior with someone else with their partner, they did report higher sexual satisfaction overall. However, I'd expect that it kind of depends. I don't think that interacting, both partners interact, being present during sex with someone else is always necessarily going to be the best thing for everyone. But it seems that just kind of sharing that can help in some cases, at least. We also have partner hierarchy. This is how the tendency for you to give some partners in your life more priority than others. So that is, I think, you hear about hierarchical or non-hierarchical polyamory, right? Where you try not to give certain partners more favor than others, or treat some partners in a way that is unfair to the well-being of the other partners, right? So that's the idea here, is some people might actually benefit from creating these clear, almost hierarchical boundaries, right? Where hey, listen, I'm married to this person. They're extremely important to me. I have this long history with them. There might be some amount of hierarchy that helps to alleviate the anxiety of, well, if we're interacting with another partner, are you potentially going to leave me for them? Is there going, will you be spending more time with them than with me because maybe you get caught up in the new relationship energy, or et cetera. So this is another one of those factors that I think is going to go both ways. Is for some people, being more hierarchical might increase relationship satisfaction, but for other people in some situations, non-hierarchy might be better, where you try not to favor certain partners over others, and that might depend on whether there's kind of an established pair bond to begin with, and whether there's kind of something we preserve there. Just very quickly, the kind of three other ones, we have resource distribution. So that is, how often do you think about how you spend time, money, and resources on each of your partners? So is it shared more equitably among your partners? Does it tend to be, concentrated on one pair bond and not so much on others? So how often you think about that? Sexual health maintenance, how often you engage in practices that are meant to stop the spread of STIs, prevent unplanned pregnancy, which is another part of sexual health. And then the last one we have here is what's called reputation management. And this, I think, is related to stigma. So how much do you kind of keep your relation, if you're in a multi-partner or CNM relationship, do you hide some of your relationships from the public, from other people? And so what we know, and this is some work done, I think Amy Morris has done work on this, Rhonda Balzerini, when relationships are secret, when you have to engage in more of this reputation management, very often that can be associated with less relationship quality, because now maybe there's one or a few partners who feel they're not being invited to family picnics. They're not being invited to Thanksgiving, right? They are the extra partner that whose association needs to be managed or maybe downplayed. So those are our strategies, the ones that we've identified so far. And I've gotten, I think, good feedback on them so far. They're fairly comprehensive. though there may be some that we're missing. And I'd love if anyone listening or if you, Eli, have thoughts on this, if there are any, other practices that we've not captured there, I think that would be a useful addition.
I think now that you've asked me, I think the emphasis on jealousy is overblown, as if that's the only reaction, the only negative reaction people can have to multi-partner relating. And interestingly enough, like, I don't have a strong jealousy streak. I get really insecure. My jealousy, like, I don't get like, no, you can't see her, I want her all to myself. I get like, oh, no wonder you want her instead of me. She's hot and I'm dumpy, like.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So there's not only that insecurity part, which does go with jealousy, but there's also, I think, as a monogamous person, to give my partner space to be with other people, I have to create distance in a relationship that I want to be close. I like the closeness, but if she's going to go off and have another girlfriend, then I can't be wrapped around her leg and she's walking out the door. So I need to be more like, okay, honey, I'm giving you space, but creating that space creates distance for me in a relationship that I like to be close. And that feels different from jealousy.
I think that is different from jealousy, right? Because jealousy is specifically, it's the emotion that you feel when you suspect that you're going to lose a relationship that is valued to you. And so then it motivates you to take effort to retain that relationship, do things to keep it going. But you're right, it's almost like it's almost like you can honestly acknowledge, like, wow, they're fantastic. Of course you'd want to spend time with them. And so it almost feels self-protective, right? To say, I want to put distance here so that I see where this is going. So I'm going to put that distance here to protect myself. And I wonder if, what would that be? I'm not sure how to label that emotion or that kind of that strategy. It almost, I don't want to call you avoidant or anything, but that almost feels like avoidant, right?
Avoidant,
like
attachment.
In terms of attachment and all that. Yeah.
Except that it's not what I want, like, it's the fallback to be like, I want to give you this freedom to do this. And in order to do that, I've got to step back. I've got to create distance. If you need space to see other people, then that space feels like distance to me, or I've got to back off, because otherwise I'm on the date with you and your girlfriend. And that's not, that's not at all what my wife wanted. She didn't want that kind of group thing. So that kind of distance was really challenging to manufacture to me. And I think that's one of the big things that indicated to me that I am monogamous by orientation. If it's that painful to manufacture and difficult to sustain. And so right before we started Bonders, Dr. Mogilski and I were talking about, is monogamy an orientation? And I was saying, I think it is an orientation for me, and I've tried to change it for years and years, and it's just not budging. But what was your response? Was that's too static for some people, or?
I'm agnostic about it. I'm not really sure if it's an orientation. I think what we know is that people have the capacity for both, and that's if you look at one of my earliest papers, it's something called strategic pluralism. That is, humans and other animals have the capacity to create more monogamous bonds that are enduring, they're long-term, they're relatively established, and then the capacity to be interested in more promiscuity, that is having several different attachments. And so I think that what you might prefer or what you go after is going to change across the lifespan. It's going to change depending on the circumstances and maybe what is possible or comfortable or what serves your best interest. I mean, I think one of the ways that I think about relationships is that they're partnerships, right? They are alliances. You decide, this is a person who I want to spend time with, my life with. I want to accomplish things with them. And so if a certain type of bonding does not help you to accomplish your life goals, or advances you, or makes you better, then perhaps you're going to be kind of more pushed to a different type of bonding, if that makes sense. So this is just my bias. I feel like a relationship orientation is probably more fluid than other types of orientations we assign to ourselves, perhaps. I mean, I'm all for the argument that, of course, sexual orientation is also fluid. There's a lot that moves there too, but I think especially relationship orientation. I think certain people are going to have preferences, absolutely, but I'm just not convinced of that. But I could be convinced.
Well, that's fascinating, and I agree. And we have some really interesting questions in the chat. One person asks, and this kind of goes back to our original discussion of evolutionary psychology. One person asks, do you think the fear that men feel while initiating the courting phase is just a cultural thing, or is it passed down genetically? So I'm going to go one step further and say, I think that fear is generally kind of qualified as fear of rejection in a way. And I'm not sure if that's what our attendee means with that. But I absolutely think, yes, people, not only men, but anyone who initiates the courting phase.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you emphasize men. I do think that men's and women's experiences of relationships, I think, are going to be somewhat different. I think that there's far more similarity than there is difference, but there probably are some very important differences. It's possible that maybe for men especially, it's difficult to kind of put yourself out there, and maybe there's that fear of rejection, is that if you think about the mating marketplace, and you think about if we take this back to the kind of origins of relationships as these reproductive contracts where you create children together, women tend to be more valued on the mating market overall. If you look at it in terms of who has the most choice, who is pickier, I think women tend to be pickier than men do on average. And so I think for men kind of going into a new relationship or trying to initiate a new relationship, you might be kind of a dime a dozen. Men are not as much in demand, I think, on the marketplace, or at least not as kind of uniquely valued. And so I think that perhaps that might be the part that's being brought in through this evolutionary history, is that men are kind of in this unique position where they might need to do more. They might need to try harder to attract a mate and successfully mate with someone than on average women would. And so that can be, I think it is fear of rejection, right? Is if you think of like, a good David Attenborough film where, the male has to put on this display, build a nest to attract a bird, a female partner, the female bird comes in, they look at the nest and they go, okay, I don't think that's good enough. And they just fly on off. That's rejection. It's the same thing. I think that men on average tend to have to kind of maybe work harder in that sense. Though I think in humans are a little bit special in that both, women compete for men in certain ways, men compete for women in certain ways, and it depends on environmental cues, such as kind of how many men and women are in a population. So there are a lot of factors that feed into it, but on average, I think you're right that it's rejection, and on average, men might experience more rejection than women do.
And I wonder if, for one thing, that maybe changes with age, that at least right now in our contemporary cohorts, once you get like into 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there's way more women than there are men. Mm-hmm. And so maybe the women get less picky or compete harder, perhaps. And I wonder if transgender and non-binary people either compete the hardest or compete within smaller areas, like will choose a venue first, choose like a queer dating app or something that's going to be not, like, does Plenty of Fish even have a transgender
Right.
category? I don't know, but I could see fear of rejection being among the highest with transgender people. And
I'm
sure
sorry, I
about
didn't mean
non-binary. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's a colleague of mine. So her name is Lisa Diamond. You may have heard of her. So I'm putting together this handbook, and she contributed a chapter looking at one of the I think overlooked unique factors that sexual and gender minority individuals just across the board might have to deal with that, cisgender heteronormative people wouldn't have to, is stigma, is fear, not just of rejection, but literally you might have people who would physically harm you, or there's a certain level of fear and trust that I think has to be overcome uniquely for people who are sexual and gender minorities. So I think that's another layer to that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have another interesting question. One of our bonders is mentioning that we had a previous speaker, Kathy Labriola, who writes a lot about, she knows a lot about jealousy. She wrote a polyamory breakup book. She wrote a book on aging in polyamorous relationships, polygeezers. So when we had her on, she said something like the value of compersion is overrated, or certainly that you were not mandated to feel compersion, and maybe trying to force yourself to feel compersion was like too big of a goal. Like maybe try to tolerate, rather than being compersive.
Ecstatic.
But so this person says, what do you think about that, given that you see it as one of the successful strategies for CNM, establishing compersion?
I think if you can get there, it's helpful, right? I have a hard time imagining a situation where being compersive would be a bad thing. Where one scenario could be, if you are compersive and you really want to see your partner sleep with someone else, form a romantic relationship with someone else, and then that leads to them leaving you, or you just, to some degree, jealousy, that negative response lets your partner know, hey, I still care, and I want you to spend time with me, and I want this. So maybe compersion in those cases could be sending a signal to your partner that, oh, you want me to spend time with someone else? You don't want me to stick around? You don't want me to do these things? You're happy for me to just go off and do my own thing? Maybe in those situations. But I feel like one of the talks, so we were at a conference together, Eli, just this past weekend, and one of the talks is on compersion, and the argument that was made by Mary, I'm going to get her last name wrong, Thween. Yeah, Thween, Mary Thween, or Marie Thween, is that to feel compersion, you might have to feel that your plate is full, right? That you are getting a lot from the relationship that you're in, and that you feel comfortable enough that if your partner were to go and have these intimate interactions with another person, that you would still be getting what you're getting. And so I think the argument is compersion's good if you are getting your needs met. If it's something kind of extra on top of what you're getting from your relationship, that then you can be happy that they're experiencing something else that they really want, that they're maybe having sex with someone that they really want to be physical with, or that they're having an intimate bond with someone that they enjoy. I think in those cases, it's kind of like, it's being happy that the other person is having their needs fulfilled. And if you look at that outside of a romantic context, I also think we would almost unilaterally say that's a good thing, right? Is if your partner gets the job of their dreams, and to be happy for them, be like, wow, I genuinely am happy that you have accomplished and you've secured something that you really want. It's hard to see how that's bad. But I take your point that might not be for everybody. Like it's hard to get there, right? It's hard to have that feeling. And I don't think that it's necessary. But at least tentatively, I'd say that it at least helps if you can get there. But to get there, that's the challenge. And I don't know if we know enough about compersion to really say step by step, how do you build it? I think there are plenty of people who are almost more of an expert on compersion than I am. So they might have more of a step by step guide. But from what I'm hearing, it's we don't. I mean, I think there's a lot that we don't know about compersion. So yeah.
But in terms of those 10 strategies that you identify, compersion actually contributes to relationship satisfaction.
Yes, and specifically sexual satisfaction. That's the strongest association. Yep.
So do you think, and I've heard this argument all sorts of other places, perhaps most notably in Sex at Dawn, that multiple partner relating is an evolutionary strategy? And I almost said hardwired, but I'm not going to use that word. How about that we are predisposed on some level evolutionarily to want multiple partners? Like even those of us who are monogamous, it's not like I've just had only one partner in my life. I've felt very deeply about different people as my life has moved on. So does that count as multi-partner? I guess maybe not all at the same time, but
yeah. So to take it to the roots, I think that there are, if we think about, again, humans as creatures that we sexually reproduce, we are creating children. There are some advantages to having multiple partners from an evolutionary standpoint. Is that if you are a man and you have you're male, I should say, and you have you have sperm, you produce gametes that are relatively cheap and that can be distributed very widely. To have sex with multiple females would allow you to have multiple children and therefore have your genes represented more in the next generation. So for men, especially,
Genghis Khan maneuver.
The Genghis Khan. What is he, like 0.5% of the entire world?
Some insane number of people on the planet
crazy.
Now trace themselves back to Genghis Khan because he was a rapist, a pillager, and a womanizer.
Warmongers. That's what happened. That's the story of war, right? That's yeah. But that's a great example, right? Is having multiple partners. And this is very early on, I think, in evolutionary sciences. That was the main argument for multi-partnering, is that men especially want multiple partners because they can do this, whereas women perhaps wouldn't want as much because women cannot spread their gametes widely. They have one egg that needs to be fertilized, invest 9 months into it, and then give birth. But what we're learning is that there might be other avenues by which women forming multiple relationships could be helpful to them as well. There are a couple of them. One, we mentioned this at the conference this past weekend, but the idea of sperm competition, whereby if you have sex with multiple men within a short period of time, that could allow those sperm in the reproductive tract to compete to fertilize the egg. And so the quote unquote best sperm might end up fertilizing the egg. The other is that having multiple partners could help with raising children. And you might have some thoughts on this as well, but to have multiple to have multiple partners, whether they're multiple male partners or multiple female partners, is they will be there and they can help create that community to raise the child, you can distribute the responsibility. So I think to some degree, forming an intimate romantic bond with multiple people could help in that sense as well. It's not spreading your genes widely, but it does ensure that the children that you have produced have a better chance of surviving and thriving and growing up and having good life outcomes. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have found that the pooled resources that multiple adults are able to bring to a family and pool them together, they end up, everybody has a little more free time, everybody has a little more money, a little more flexibility to do what they want to do. And sometimes that's date other people, sometimes that's sleep, sometimes that's go to school, sometimes it's exercise, but that it does people feel more satisfied when they can rely on other people. Like, okay, I can go do this thing because I know my child is in good hands with this other person.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And now that my sample is really moving out of that kind of small child zone into these emerging adults, I'm
Mm.
seeing not only it's super helpful for those emerging adults, but the older adults that are caring for their dying parents or dealing with, I've had numerous respondents talk to me about going back to their metamor's home, parents' home with their partner. So it's like the three of them go and attack this house full of
Mm.
75 years of stuff. And it's so much easier than if it was just the one person. And
Mhm.
that just makes a lot of sense. I feel like it
Yeah.
kind of on both ends and all the way through the middle, just as humans, we need other people and we're too disconnected from each other too frequently, I think, in contemporary society. So I absolutely see the draw of multiple partner relationships. And I kind of wish I could make myself happy in them.
All right. Yeah, and that's the challenge. I was gonna say something and I just lost the thought. It'll come back to me. But yeah, I I feel like the reason we discourage, I think overall society might discourage multi-partner relationships is because you can get rivalry, right? So the flip side of that is you have multiple people together. One person might, you know, your partner starts spending more time with them, or maybe there's this kind of tension that you feel between you and a new partner because maybe they're not respecting your relationship in the way that you wished it were being respected, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there are challenges, right? And I get why people, you know, want to be monogamous and have, I think to some degree, monogamy might be more simple. You have to worry about less. You have to manage less, right? You can be sure that that person is kind of giving you their energy. But on the flip side of that, if you could address those issues, if you had strategies for reducing that conflict, the rivalry or the time being split between partners, you then get all these benefits of just being in a group of people who care about you, that you care about. You help them with, you know, their struggles. You help them clean out a house. You know, it's just, again, take this out of the romantic context. You have larger groups of people who are coordinating. Communities are more robust to things happening to them. You know, they're going to survive. They can help each other out. There's
More
a lot
resilient.
that you can, they're more resilient. There's a lot to it. But the problem is in the romantic contexts, there's all these, there jealousy and resource sharing and childcare and all these other things that I think add a little bit, that are a little bit more complicated than, say, coordinating a you know, a bunch of people at a farmer's market or some other community, right? Groups of people who help each other out. So that's the hurdle, and that's what I hope comes from our international project, is that we're going to give people these tools. Is we're going to be able to say, okay, if you want these, you know, if you want to multi-partner, maybe you should try some of these things to help reduce some of the conflict, such that you get the most benefit from having those relationships, you know, and you don't have to worry about that conflict as much. I think if we could do that, that would be, I don't know. I think it would just be a win-win for everybody, to tell you the truth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we are almost out of time. I want to ask the people who are here, our audience, if you have any questions, now's the time, because we are coming down to the last few minutes. So pop them in the chat. We had some really good ones, some interesting questions. Absolutely. So what's next for you, Dr. Mogilski?
Well, I go up for tenure next year, so hopefully
Oh,
I'll
scary Larry.
Yeah, I know. So that's the most immediate thing. But in terms of the project, so now that we've identified that this measure does predict relationship satisfaction, it's all correlational. And anyone who knows stats, correlation, you can't say that just because two variables are related to one another doesn't mean that one causes the other. So the next step is to design a study. Well, we already have this study designed, is to administer this study, where we ask people to adopt some of these strategies that we've identified, to see whether experimentally manipulating them, asking some people to engage in these behaviors, other people not to, and then tracking their relationship quality across time, seeing whether adopting these practices actually causes a change in their satisfaction, et cetera. So that's the next big step. And so scientifically, I need to show causation. That's the big next step. And I think if we can do that, that's really going to open up all kinds of possibilities. For that, we need, I'm looking for, clinical collaborators, people who do therapy. I think that to some degree, administering this is far more ambitious than I initially planned, but we have the design and we just need to cinch up a few more little technicalities, but it's there. So that's the next step.
And then I always, when I hear about like a clinical trial with a placebo, and so I'm almost thinking like not doing anything is the placebo, like not changing anything. The ethics of that, if you know that this works better, but I guess what you're saying is you have correlation and not causation. So you don't know that this works better. These things tend to co-occur.
Right. And one of the things that I want to do to have a true placebo is there'll at least probably be one group that receives a want clinical intervention or a therapeutic intervention. So it's not just, you're not going to do anything, you want your relationship to be better. Oh, you're going to be in the placebo group. You're not going to get anything. And you just have to deal with that. But
watch
actually,
more TV.
Yeah, exactly. But one group might actually receive something that has been shown to work well for, just relationship therapy in general. And so we can see, do these practices add something above and beyond established therapeutic interventions?
Fantastic. That totally deals with that. I love that. I love that idea.
Yeah.
So we've got one comment and then a question. Just to give a shout out to South Carolina, as a bi-poly guy who grew up in the rural South Carolina, but now lives in California, I'm in happy shock to see a scholar in my home state leading in this area. Woo, Justin.
Thank you. I'll tell you, I was kind of surprised that the university supported my research. I framed it largely as a public health intervention, so I think that helps. But
around STIs?
Yeah, around that, but also generally around, rivalry and because violence between marital happiness, violence between especially men, they can get into fisticuffs when they compete over relationship partners, things like that. So I think framing it that way has helped a lot. But my university has been actually surprisingly supportive, and I respect them a lot for it.
That's fantastic.
They've never given me a hard time for it. The University of South Carolina is I give them huge respect points, but awesome. Happy to provide it to South Carolina.
So our last question, do you think women are more evolutionarily predisposed to polyamory than men? Because it seems there are a lot of couples with a poly woman and a mono man. And I have to say, I've also seen it go the other way. A mono woman with a poly man.
Maybe specifically polyamory. So I like to distinguish polyamory from just general non-monogamy or multi-partnering. I think polyamory is specifically, you are forming these deep, romantic, emotional bonds with other people. And I think on average, we tend to see that women compared to men tend to care a lot about kind of those attachments and that feeling of intimacy. So it's possible that, yes, women might be more drawn. So I remember Jana actually threw some stats out there, and it turns out if you actually look at the percentages, men are more likely to be interested in doing polyamory overall. But specifically that element of emotional bonding, I might expect that women would be more interested in that, versus men might be more predisposed to types of non-monogamy that are focused more on sexual interaction, on kind of novelty, novel romantic partner, intimate partner, sexual partners, etc. But it's interesting, you're right, that there might be a poly woman and a mono guy, and that might be related to, again, kind of sexual economics, the mating marketplace, where women can be choosier and men might actually have to. In some cases, men might have, if a woman kind of wants that, the man might to some degree be motivated to make that work with her in order to keep that pair bond going. Because if she's the choosy one and he has to maybe work harder, I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with that, but there might be a world where, I need to clarify my thoughts about that, but there might be a world where people might be more kind of willing to be with a partner who wants non-monogamy if they realize that their partner wants it and their partner is valuable to them. And so you'd say, well, absolutely. You know what, if this is something that would make you happy, this relates to compersion, right? If this would make you happy, if you would enjoy this, then I would want to give this to you. And it makes me happy that you have this in your life and that I can, that I can do that for you. So I don't know. I'm feeling okay about my answer to that, but that's my response.
And we have a comment to that. That might be more due to social conditioning than anything else. Patriarchy conditions women to be caretakers and emotional suppression to men.
Oh, interesting. So you think maybe men are suppressing their feelings about being with these partners? Is that the argument?
Or that this person just clarified men will only open up to lovers. So they don't have this wider emotional base, like they need.
Oh, I see. Oh, interesting. Sure.
To have that contact, whereas women can have more intensive contact with each other or friendship. And I imagine non-binary and transgender people might also follow that more kind of clinically or technically feminine style of a wider emotional net than a kind of a heterosexual man who's maybe more likely to need that partner. Certainly under patriarchy, heterosexual men are not supposed to show each other their weaknesses.
Yeah.
Not supposed to have weaknesses, pretty much.
Right. That's
fascinating. Show them to
anyone. Yeah, that's fascinating. The idea that women on average have larger social networks might predispose them to polyamory because they've already got the network, and it's just a matter of kind of opening yourself up to those particular types of intimate bonds, right? But maybe the ammunition's already there, so to speak. The kind of potential is already there. That's interesting. That's fascinating. I hadn't considered that before.
So one person says, have you looked into Terry Real, R-E-A-L, Terry Real, who I'm assuming has written something on men's emotional connection with each other. And then another person, I think, very rightly points out that this is kind of a US-centric conversation, that they add men in some parts of Europe, for example, are much more emotionally open than men in the US. And we do, I think, hyper-capitalism, not only patriarchy, but hyper-capitalism has a very competitive edge to it that might then prohibit people who want to be like successful in some way from being emotionally vulnerable with each other. That's a great point.
That is a great point. I like that idea about hyper competitiveness. You're right. When you are feeling competitive with others, you don't want to open up to them. You don't want to trust them, right? No, it's not safe. It's legitimately
give them ammunition. It's not a good idea.
Yeah. I like that. That's interesting.
Well, Justin Mogilski, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Bonding Hour. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
Happy to do it anytime. This is fun. I enjoy this. This inspires me. This gets my cogs spinning. So
the creative juices flowing.
Yes, I like this very much. This was fun. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks all you bonders who came to share this Bonding Hour with us. I hope you all have a delightful afternoon or evening or night or whatever time it is for you. Bye, everybody.